Good morning, everybody. I'm going to give about a minute or two just for some last people to join, and then we can officially start the proceedings. Okay, I think we can start officially. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. And thank you especially to our speaker today, Prof. Dewald van Niekerk. I'm going to ask Christo if you can just open the meeting formally for us, and then we can start. Thanks.
Good morning, colleagues. Welcome at another webinar arranged by one of the Centers of Excellence, or in this case, in particular, our disaster management platform, so that we keep our members informed and keep them also on their toes in terms of what's happening in the space. So in particular, warm welcome to Prof. Dewald. I think we shared a platform some time ago, just before the official announcement was then made of by the president, and we then met and said, I thought let's bring him on board at Agri SA to inform our members as well, in terms of obviously at that time we opposed the state of disaster, but now we have a state of disaster and what it means in practice. And how can we then, as a sector, make the most of it? Our primary responsibility is food security. Section 27 of the Constitution makes it very explicit that our people must have access to food and water. These are basic needs. And the agriculture sector plays a critical role in this regard. And obviously, given the economic context, the socio-economic context, the geopolitical context, we remain under severe pressure to fulfill this particular obligation. But let's give over to you, Andrea, that is the official facilitator of this webinar this morning, to take it further. But welcome to all of you.
Thank you so much, Christo, for the warm introduction. I'm going to first off by starting to introduce Professor Dewald van Niekerk. He is a professor in geography and the founder and the head of the African Center of Disaster Studies at Northwest University Potchefstroom campus. Dewald is also a South African NRFB-rated researcher, and he obtained his PhD in 2005 in disaster risk governance and was promoted to full professor in 2012. He has authored and co-authored more than 100 publications, and he's the program manager for the Disaster Risk Sciences Research Group of the Unit of Environmental Sciences and Management. He is the founder and editor-in-chief and an accredited journal, JAMBA, Journal of Disaster Risk Studies, and he played an active part in the development of the South African Disaster Management Act, what we have today, as well as the Disaster Management Framework of 2005. I officially want to welcome Professor Dewald van Niekerk to this morning. Kulani, who is our chief economist, will also facilitate a question and answer session at the end of the session. So please make sure that you raise all your questions in the chat box. Alternatively, put up your hand when we have the session at the end. But I want to hand over to Professor. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm quickly going to share my screen. I hope it comes out right on your side. Do you see a split screen, or do you see the full presentation if I do that?
We see the full presentation. You can proceed.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
I never know between Zoom and Teams what happens when you share your screen. It's sometimes quite daunting, although we've been busy with this medium now for so many years. As I said, thank you very much for hosting me. Thank you for this opportunity to share some thoughts on where we are currently and how we got to this point, and also possibly looking at where can we go with this state of disaster into the future, and what it means to us, and then obviously also the agricultural sector. I'm quite amazed that in such a small span of time of about 3 years, the Disaster Management Act has become a common term to use and a common document to refer to. We've struggled since 2002 to get this piece of legislation, as well as the National Disaster Management Framework, implemented by government at all levels. It's been an extremely slow process, but you know, as Churchill said, you just need one good disaster, don't waste it. And it's good. I think it's good that we have so many people focusing on disaster risk issues, although the general population still only sees this term disaster, and that's where they stop. But we'll talk about that a bit in a while. What I would like to do is to focus on where we find ourselves currently with the Eskom crisis and load shedding as a state of disaster, and ask a few questions around it. What we obviously need to agree upon from the start is that we do sit with an extremely complex situation. There's quite a few arguments for and against what I'll be saying as well. So please don't take my advice and my viewpoint as the alpha and the omega. There's many people with different entry points on the argument as well, and it's good to have these type of conversations. So I think the first question we need to ask ourselves is, if we look at the Disaster Management Act, when do we actually talk about this thing called a disaster? Now, I do this exercise many times with my students in class, especially people coming from various cultures as we have here today. And in many languages and in cultures in South Africa, we do not have a word that equates to this English word called a disaster. There's sometimes one word we use for many things, which would be a disaster, hazard, occurrence that's out of the ordinary. Yet we sit with this word disaster that has so many different meanings and different interpretations throughout the world. And it is fine. It's a word that we use in so many languages, and it's a word in English that is obviously interpreted by many people. But at the end of the day, we sit with the Disaster Management Act. We sit with this term called disaster management. We're looking at disaster risk management more these days. And it's important that we reach a point where we define what this means. And this was certainly one of the major, I won't say problems, but discussions we had when we were drafting the Disaster Management Act, and we had to come up with a definition. Now, just some brief background. What happened in that period, 1998, 1999, going into 2000s, there was a global shift away from focusing only on disaster response and disaster recovery issues. Many people agreed we can't go on the way we have been doing for the past how many decades. There's a different way of focusing on this thing called a disaster. And that discussion kind of found its way into the discussions of the Disaster Management Act. And one thing that was clear was that we need to somehow box this definition. Otherwise, it runs the risk of having no meaning whatsoever. And in that process, we opted for a definition that was aligned with what was happening internationally. But interesting, if you look back on the history, there was a shift towards the definition accepted by South Africa on the international context. We were one of the very first countries to actually promulgate this new generation disaster law, disaster management law, which has got a much more kind of nuanced focus towards disaster risk management than just disaster response issues, although it is there. So the assumption was always that this is a disaster is something out of the ordinary, or it's something extraordinary. It's not something that is in the normal day-to-day process of our development as human beings, as we would expect it to be. If we speak to the normal person on the street and we ask them, how would you define a disaster? It would obviously equate to something that I don't expect, something that comes out of nowhere, something that has got a major impact on me. And that's typically what we had to box as this definition of a disaster. And what, as we talk about now, the state of disaster. And there's this assumption that there's some kind of disruption, either in the social or in the physical order in which we find ourselves. And in that process, we need to do certain things. Certain actions need to kick in, whether it is for preventative measures or whether it is for reaction. We sit with, in our discipline, a focus on what people would refer to as slow and rapid onset hazards or disasters. Typically, your droughts would be a slow onset, and floods, etc., flash flooding would be rapid onset. But there's a drive towards looking at disasters as all of them are slow onset hazards. So there's kind of a shift in focus to say, don't just think of the flood as something that might happen quickly. We know that something might happen. So we need to change our perspective to say all disasters or all hazards has got this potential and they are slow onset. We just need to have the science and the understanding on our side to do something about that. And that's certainly something that we see in research and in the academia taking place now. People are more and more realizing that it's within the human domain to do something. So let's go back to this definition of a disaster. So in the Disaster Management Act, it gives us the following definition. It says, if I can get my slide to move on, it says the following. It is a serious disruption of the normal functioning of society. So that equates to that first portion. So we could understand in the various circumstances what normal functioning would mean. We would obviously be possible to equate it to something that has got a serious disruption. And we can also look at what do we mean by society, but I'll come back to that in a second. And here's the interesting part about our definition. And sometimes people just read over it and they don't realize what it means. And that is, it said it threatens to cause, or it causes human, material, or environmental losses. And that threaten to cause gives us a window of opportunity, a window of possible foresight, and a window of disaster risk reduction. And I'll just circle back to that in a second. And then obviously, as I said, it exceeds our ability to cope using our own resources. And it talks about the affected community. Now, in our case, a state of disaster, there was a lot of discussion on when is a disaster, a state of disaster affecting a community? What do we mean by this term community? Do we mean a settlement, let's say informal settlement, maybe in an urban area? Do we mean a certain suburb? How do we go about determining whether this thing adheres to the definition? And the fallback was on the administrative structures of South Africa. And the consensus was, we have, at that stage, we had wall-to-wall municipalities. It was quite recently, if I remember correctly, coming into the 2000s. And we could manage these extraordinary events within our administrative structures. So literally this affected community became local municipalities, district municipalities, metro municipalities, provinces, and then also national. And that's where we included this escalating effect of disasters. In the past, under the Civil Protections Act, only the president declared areas as disaster areas. With the decentralization of government, this fitted quite well with giving the mandate to our municipalities, provinces, and obviously national, and giving them some kind of guidance on when a state of disaster is applicable to their sphere of government. And I still support that principle and that we put down there, because I think it's a logical way of managing. And then obviously there's this escalating effect. If it's more than one municipality in the same district, or one municipality can't cope, it becomes a district issue, it becomes province and national, or something as we saw with COVID and now with the the floods affecting more than one province, and now the electricity crisis, we can talk about a national state of disaster. But the state of disaster remains important. And that comes back to that second point that I highlighted in this definition, the threatened to cause. We don't declare disaster, we declare state of disaster. So there's an acknowledgement that we find ourselves in a position that could or have led to these massive losses. And this is one of the plays where that government is using to justify the electricity crisis as a state of disaster. We saw with COVID-19 that it was the very first time in the history of South Africa that we declared a national state of disaster, and it was actually declared from a disaster risk reduction perspective. We saw what was happening in the rest of the world. We knew if we let this go, we might sit with an untenable situation, and government used the state of disaster to minimize possible future losses. And we saw there was, as with any other disaster situation globally, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly linked to that. But that is very important, that our definition of a disaster allows us this proactive approach as well, which was lauded by the international community as one of the best definitions and the best ways of looking at disaster law out there. And as I said, I still fully support this definition as long as it is implemented according to the intent of the Disaster Management Act, and then also the framework. And that's what I want to just talk about briefly, is what is very important when it comes to disaster or emergency law is that we understand clearly what the intent of that legislation was. Although we try to put it in boxes, as we know with the law, there's always gray areas that goes a bit beyond what we intended the legislation to be. And it depends on who uses various arguments within the legal structure. We can kind of, it's a mutable situation. We can get away with certain things that might not have been the intent of the law in the first place. But the intent of the Disaster Management Act, I think, is extremely clear. If we read the first two sections of the law, it gives us that quite clearly, and it says that the first idea of the Disaster Management Act was to make South Africa safer. It came out of a process post-1994 when we saw massive floods in the Western Cape, close to Parliament. We had a new government. They said this situation is not good. We need to do something. And that spearheaded the process of the Disaster Management Act with intent to make people safe, which is good. I mean, that's what government is supposed to do. It's one of our core principles of our constitution. The other intent of the Disaster Management Act and the framework was changing the paradigm from disaster response, having a specific section. I think many of the older people in on the call would remember burgerlike beskerming or civil protection, which was specifically responsible for a response in rural areas, sometimes also urban centers, linked to sometimes the fire station or some unit within government. But the focus was very much on protecting certain groups of people against certain events, if this would happen. So it was a total reactive focus. And the Disaster Management Act, the intent of it now was to change that, to say, no, it's not just the responsibility of one unit. It's the responsibility of many sectors and many disciplines. So it's trying to bring everyone in the fold. And I think what happened with COVID and the focus on the Department of Health made it quite clear how important it becomes for various sectors to include disaster risk management within their area of expertise. I mean, Agri SA, with the unit that you have now, is a very good example. The massive work that Niekerk was doing in the years following the Disaster Management Act, I think laid a very good foundation for the agricultural sector to bring this. And I think still the agricultural sector, in my mind, is one of the leaders when it comes to including disaster risk within their sphere of influence. And then obviously the other intent was this shift away from disaster management, although we still call it the Disaster Management Act. I tried to push quite hard to have it called the Disaster Risk Management Act, but it wasn't popular at the time. But now people are talking about disaster risk management. So I think there's probably some value in pushing that agenda. And the idea around disaster risk reduction or disaster risk management is to address vulnerabilities and then also to address hazards. So the focus changed significantly from we need just contingency plans in place if something happens, to how do we lessen the vulnerabilities within communities, to the possible impact of various hazards that might exploit them to this extent that it adheres to the definition of a disaster. And that's where it opened up the conversation to so many other sectors. And I thought it would catch on like a wildfire, and it didn't. Because a lot of people still felt these disaster management centers within government, it's their responsibility. Recently, the conversation has now changed a bit to resilience thinking. And what I've seen in various governments is that many sectors feel much more comfortable with using the resilience focus, also linked into climate change adaptation issues, to bring in disaster risk reduction. So it's kind of just the other area that they use to do what we want to do in disaster risk reduction, and that is address vulnerabilities and then obviously hazards through normal hazard science. And then the last part, what we are talking about today, is that the intent of the Disaster Management Act was to provide for exceptional circumstances. In other words, those things beyond the normal as we know. And with the disaster management framework, the Act says we need a framework that provides the implementation of the Act, which we do have. I don't know what has happened in the past in terms of people adopting the framework, but it wasn't very successful. I can't give you reasons for that. But a lot of the questions sometimes being asked, the answers you'll find in the National Disaster Management Framework. So if people aren't aware of that piece of document, it's an imposing 100-page document that gives us quite a lot of the how part of the what that is contained in the Disaster Management Act. And that focuses on primarily on vulnerability reduction, like I said, addressing anthropogenic and natural hazards, and then reducing the risk. And as all of you know, there's two major components to risk, as we've said so many times, the vulnerability and the hazard part. And it's a complex calculation to make it. It's not so easy just to say, okay, let's reduce risk of disasters. There's so many working parts and so many systems that's interlinked and dependent on each other. And the exceptions comes in when these systems on which we depend and that various processes fail, or in our case, then threaten to fail. Then it becomes an issue of disaster risk and disaster risk management. But let's then just quickly look at the exception part of it. Now, Disaster Management Act, as well as the State of Emergency Act, is seen as exceptional legislation. In other words, it's legislation that provides for certain things if our normal circumstances is not adequate. Exceptional law also, as we saw with COVID, can lead to the suspension of certain human rights and certain freedoms, and it's justified according to the situation we found ourselves in. Now, forgetting about COVID and the electricity crisis for a second, within the agricultural sector, if there's a massive stress in terms of food security, certainly it would make absolute sense to suspend certain rights and freedoms in order for us to mitigate the situation. It will be justified. If we say, well, we need to cut back on certain supplying of certain goods and services to people, or we need to look at water restrictions, or whatever the case may be, because we might sit in a situation of massive food insecurity, I think everyone here would agree it's most probably justified. And the general people out there would also say this is justified. Now let's look at what happened in COVID. When the first lockdown happened, a lot of people went, I think we were kind of schizophrenic in the start. It was like, wonderful, now I can spend time at home, yet the normal day-to-day things need to carry on, and now my children is home with me and I have to homeschool, and oh my goodness, all of a sudden it's not such a good idea. But the intent behind it, people understood. I think people understood it quite well. What followed from there, it's obviously history, and there's a lot of questions whether it was good or bad. But that being said, there was an acceptance that you may infringe through exceptional law on my freedoms, because I know it's for the greater good. And in a democracy, we agree if law is passed through our parliament, it is accepted by the majority, therefore it is justified. And that's where we are today. But we still sit with these two pieces of legislation. And many people have asked me, why not a state of emergency instead of a state of disaster. Now, in terms of the State of Emergency Act, it is very specific in the sense that it is martial law. It provides the president with absolute power, and it's mostly justified by the threat to the sovereignty of the state. So it's not, although it's mentioned that the natural disasters are mentioned, we actually try to get that amended out of the State of Emergency Act, but that wasn't successful. There wasn't an appetite for that at that stage. But it gives the president far-reaching powers. But the crux of the matter is, does this affect the sovereignty of South Africa? And that is obviously not the case where we find ourselves now. So the Disaster Management Act makes provision for these other aspects, what we would call disasters. But the key of exceptional law is that it applies when other laws are not adequate. So we've tried everything, we put everything in place in order to manage our risk. Remember, it's not just a focus here on something that has happened. It's a longer-term focus. I would imagine that the Department of Health, as an example, have learned a lot through COVID, and they're implementing different contingency measures and risk reduction measures. But if anything else does not apply, then it becomes a situation where we can say, let's invoke this exceptional law. Now, in the case of the Disaster Management Act, it is both an administrative law and an exceptional law. So it provides us with a framework in which we have to govern disaster risk management, but then also it provides for this situation of declaring a state of disaster on whichever level we find ourselves. So let's just quickly look at how did we get to where we are at this stage, and how does it work? The initial conversation around how do we declare a state of disaster is actually quite ironic, because that small group of people that discussed this in 1999 said, we need to be quite clear because it is open for abuse. If we allow this, that municipalities can just on their own declare a state of disaster, we might find a situation where they are going to use this extraordinary tool to do ordinary things. Now, this was said in 1999, 2000, round about there, which is quite ironic if you think where we are now. And a kind of I won't say a hurdle was brought in, but a process that would provide a much more scientific focus on whether a state of disaster is in actual fact a state of disaster. And we brought in the classification and the declaration. So how the process works for the state of disaster is the head of the National Disaster Management Center, obviously through the various committees, etc., through scientific assessments and based on scientific data, will classify a state of disaster. Now, that could be pre or post the notice of declaration. So you might have a local municipality coming up with a local declaration of a state of disaster. It's then the responsibility of the head of the National Disaster Management Center to invoke a classification, and if he or she agrees with that, then it basically ratifies the declaration. Or it could happen the other way around, where we can see something is going bad. The National Disaster Management Center would do their assessments, they would classify it and go to the minister and say, listen, there's no other way out, we need to declare a state of disaster. So there's a lot of questions around this electricity crisis where we now can ask about this classification part. What was the scientific assessment? On which data did the head of the center base his classification of this crisis? So that's just keeping the back of your mind. That's just one question. And then obviously the minister, in a case of a national state of disaster, declares it, or a premier, or then the municipal council in terms of local municipalities. So you can see it's kind of a logical process that we need to follow with a bit of a check and a balance in there. Now we need to ask ourselves, with that in the background, do we actually sit in a state of disaster for the electricity crisis? And this is where the complexity comes in. And unfortunately, with so many things, when we talk about disaster risk, there's this yes and a no answer. On the one hand, we want to safeguard people That's what the intent of the law is. We want to ensure that people have got a sustainable livelihood, that they can prosper, and that we develop sustainably. I mean, we all agree to that. Therefore, if we look at the electricity crisis, there's yes answers linked to this question. But there's also quite a number of no answers also linked to it. And I think it basically revolves around two elements, which I will come to in a second. Now, in the case of the state of disaster, yes, the electricity crisis does adhere to some of the elements. If we say it's extraordinary circumstances in which I find ourselves, I don't think anyone out there would disagree that this is extremely extraordinary. We've had load shedding for so many years, but now we found ourselves in 2023 with not a day without load shedding. This is not normal. Our normal was that we had load shedding occasionally, which is also very sad if you think about it. I mean, my children, all of them grew up and they never had a year without load shedding. It's like part of who we are as South Africans. So it's normalized. Yet now government says we are entering a period where those that's affected is going to be affected even more. And the reason for that is there might be a total collapse of our electricity grid and our electricity supply. Now that, yes, definitely is something extraordinary. It's something that we don't want. We can just imagine the knock-on effects, and we already see the knock-on effects of this within the economy, within people's environment, and within communities. So it's not something that we want. So yes, definitely. If the intent is to safeguard those affected, yes, then I would say it adheres to the definition of a disaster. However, it does not fit well with this ordinary meaning of disaster. And also, I've got questions around the intent of using a state of disaster for what we want to achieve, but I'll come back to that in a second. My second last point is, why does it not fit well with this ordinary meaning of a state of disaster? If we do an assessment, the scientific assessment that I talked about, it's very clear that we do it according to what is affected or what could affect us, whether it's vulnerability or hazards. In this case, it's very difficult to put your thumb on what drives the scientific assessment to say a disaster is, or this event is a state of disaster. We can't put our thumb on it. It's very difficult to pinpoint what it is. Some people would say, yeah, well, it's the failure of the electricity grid. Well, that's obviously, but it's a very narrow way of focusing on it. We need to ask the question why this is so. Well, it's corruption. Okay, well, should we declare a state of disaster for corruption then? Or is it the supply chain? Or is it the coal mafia? Or is it, see, there's so many things that's underlying to this that does not fit quite well within the domain of disaster risk management. Then also, does it fit with the intent of a state of disaster? In other words, does it adhere to the definition partially? Would a state of disaster fix the problems? And that's where we can ask a lot of questions. And I'm going to come to that in a second. So now what a state of disaster should do is these regulations. Now, here's the question that I'm asking myself as well. The state of disaster was declared the 9th of February. We had regulations only out on the 27th. If it was such a huge issue to declare state of disaster, why are we waiting so long for regulations? Now the regulations comes out, and I've read them, and I keep reading them because I'm afraid I'm missing something. And unfortunately, I don't think I'm missing what I'm reading. There's not a lot of flesh around these regulations. But there's a subtext that I read, which bothers me quite a lot. And that is certain things have almost been hidden or tried to be hidden within those regulations. And a lot of it relate to environmental protection issues. And I don't know if I'm probably biased, but personally, I can't read past this. As soon as I get to those sections, the other sections just means nothing to me, because we can do whatever the other regulations say we want to do through our normal day-to-day things and also normal day-to-day. There's a question that we can ask, and I certainly think it's something that's going to be challenged in court as well. Why these regulations and what actually do they say? Listening to the grapevine, there's a lot of disaster management centers at provincial and local level that say, I have no idea how to implement these regulations. Who's responsible for these regulations at province, and even worse at local level? Who's responsible for a grid failure at local level? Who needs to do? So there's so many questions being asked about these regulations. if we compare it to those in COVID, I'm not saying the stupid regulations in COVID, it was easier to implement them. So there is also a gray area and a question that can be asked. If we have these regulations, certainly they must serve some kind of a purpose and allow for the bettering of a state of disaster. And yes, the thing that I'm seeing, there's two things, there's two conversations coming up. The first thing is what the intent was. Is it to fix Eskom or is it to protect livelihoods? If we say this, but you would expect the regulations to address those issues. And a few of the regulations just hint on them. Now you can, if you're privileged enough, you can put in solar and you can claim back money through tax. That's wonderful. A lot of people are doing it. A lot of extra capacity is added to the grid. It still does not protect those that's most at risk and those that has no money and those that's poor. So shouldn't these regulations talk about those elements? If we say the intent of Disaster Management Act is to safeguard lives and livelihoods, and that is where it falls short in my book. Then also, what bothers me quite a lot is what is the precedent that this is creating? In other words, if we allow something that is clearly a governance failure over years to be declared a state of disaster, what then? Will we find that local municipalities are going to declare their lack of ability to fix their roads as a local state of disaster, or the lack of schools and proper infrastructure in schools as a state of disaster, or unemployment as a state of disaster? This thing could become unruly. And once the court makes a ruling on something like this, it opens up so many avenues that we don't want. And that is not the intent, I think, of the Disaster Management Act ever. The intent of the Disaster Management Act, as we said, was to safeguard lives and livelihoods and to provide an environment for sustainable development, not to ensure that sustainable development occurs. And that is a problem for me. The other question, can other legislation deal with the issue? If I read through the regulations, with the exception of a few, there's other laws and processes that makes provision for this. Interesting enough, I think, and this is where the government is once again scoring an own goal. I think it was yesterday, a day before yesterday, the Minister of Environmental Affairs and Forestry, or I don't know, the names changed so many times, I can't remember what they're called anymore. But Minister Creedy said that no environmental protection legislation will be bypassed. In other words, she's basically saying the provisions now made through a state of disaster, through the regulations, is not going to apply. Can she do that? No, she can't, but she's saying that. And a question, like I said, will this fix Eskom? I don't think. Will it protect lives and livelihoods? Most probably. But, and the but part is load shedding in itself. Load shedding is not the problem. Load shedding is a risk management tool implemented to ensure that we don't reach a point where the grid fails. Therefore, one would expect that through this load shedding process, this risk management tool, there would be certain flags put in place. In other words, if we reach a stage 7 and we know that we're going to stay at stage 7 or stage 8, does that justify now a state of disaster? There wasn't any communication in this process. This management tool has been shown to be effective. We haven't had a grid failure yet in 17 years, but we don't, well, I don't know what is happening behind the scenes. When does this now so quickly escalate up to a level, I don't know, whatever, and then we sit with a major problem. Yet we want to say the risk management tool is the problem, and that doesn't make sense to me as well. And then the other question is, what else can the government do under state of disaster? And we quite know that it gives them far-reaching power. So we've seen one set of regulations. What is to follow? What's the next set of regulations that we're going to see? Because there's already quite a lot of criticism being flung at this set of regulations. What's the next step? And that we obviously have to wait and see. So in conclusion, just looking at the exiting of state of disaster, now myself and a colleague of mine, we wrote an article on the exiting a state of disaster under the COVID regulations, which showed to be extremely difficult. Now, we all know the state of disaster is put in place for 3 months and it can be extended on a month-on-month basis. In COVID, we had 22 extensions of this national state of disaster and all the other interesting things that went with it. However, we couldn't exit the state of disaster. If you think back on it, government had no plan to breach the regulations with no state of disaster. And what happened at the end, which is still quite laughable, is that the regulations was actually, or the state of disaster was actually ended, but new regulations under the state of disaster still continued, which is extremely weird because your state of disaster at the end of the day governs whether regulations are put in place or not. And if you think back on those last sets of regulations, everyone just ignored them. Nothing actually happened in terms of implementing or ensuring that those regulations are kept in place. And then what we have to ask ourselves, how long will this now take to achieve the intent of the state of disaster? And it comes back to those 2 points. Do we intend to fix Eskom with the state of disaster, or do we intend to reach a point where people are safe and have sustainable electricity? Because I don't think the fixing of Eskom and ensuring that people do not suffer because of massive outages is 100% the same thing. There was plans put in place quite a number of years ago already to kind of fix Eskom, and we haven't been able to do that. But there's other things we can do where Eskom is not the major focus, but ensuring that we don't have a blackout and all the nasties that goes with that. So I think in the months to come, we will probably have more clear answers of this, but this is my take on the state of disaster and where we find ourselves. And I would love to hear some comments and questions from all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Prof. And yeah, it was a very insightful session. I think we all somewhere asked ourselves these questions when there's simultaneous disasters declarations now with Eskom and the flooding and droughts in the past. All these questions that you have obviously raised today, and by understanding the principles and the fundamentals of the Disaster Management Act and the framework, I think we all sometimes forget about the framework and what the intent is of these two pieces of legislation, how it will unfold. So while I'm listening, you answered a lot of the questions I personally have, but I'm going to ask my colleague Kulani Sawea. He's going to facilitate the question and answer session now. And then I see there is some questions in the chat box. So Kulani, over to you.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you so much, Prof, for the insightful session. Yeah, so I think I'm on the same boat with Andrea, where I also had so many questions coming into the session, but your presentation was so thorough and comprehensive that it answered most of the questions that I had personally in this front. So maybe let me not hog the line and just go straight into the chat box, where I see there have been a few questions that have been posed. I see one from Conrad, where he says, what is the criteria to lift the state of disaster? And I guess in this particular context, it's with the energy crisis? Is it when load shedding ends? Is that a criteria enough, or how would that work? Followed by that question, I see Jack's question as well, Jack Armour from the Free State, where he has noted that load shedding has seriously impacted on communications and just the infrastructure that is attached to that. We have noted that in many of the provinces, there's issues of network signals because of the towers being off, or they don't have backup batteries. So in this case, can regulations be used to deal with the communication aspect of things that are impacted by load shedding? And then I'll just, maybe if you can take those questions first, and then we'll continue from there, Prof. Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much, Kulani. The first question, what is our criteria to lift a state of disaster? That's a very, very interesting and a very important question to ask. In the case of the current state of disaster, obviously, if circumstances does not adhere to the state of disaster anymore, that would be the easiest answer. Brings me back to my last slide, is how do we exit it? What is the criteria? So you would expect in regulations that this criteria is set forth, or even in the declaration of the state of disaster, to say, okay, if we can bring load shedding down sustainably to level 2, then we don't need a state of disaster anymore. But there's no indication of this. And that's problematic, because we're going to find ourselves in the same situation as we were in with COVID. We had no idea how to exit it. And it's very easy to draw that line. But I don't think government has made that calculation yet. Or they have, but they're probably just ignoring it if they do have it. If we can use the load shedding as a risk management tool with these various thresholds, certainly you can link state of disaster to a threshold and say, okay, with the amount of electricity we've put into the grid, we need to look at level 3, then we can stop the state of disaster. And it's easy. The minister can at any time stop a state of disaster. So it's not a difficult process, but it's a very interesting question. I don't think it's when load shedding ends, because when it ends, I have no idea. The second question around the can regulations be used for emergency power supply, if I read it correctly, and backup and communication? Absolutely. That is, I think, one of the aspects covered by the regulations, that it now requires government entities to ensure that there's sufficient backup power, which, if you think of it, is also kind of an own goal. But anyway, so yes, your regulations can definitely be used for that, and it is supposed to do that. But there's no indication around the specific funding and process for that. And this is why I see sub-national level, where there's too many questions now. Okay, how do we do this? How do we budget for this? What procurement processes do we use? Who's going to? There's too many questions around that. Although, yes, regulations, as I said, with extraordinary legislation, you can do so many things with it, positive and negative. But I think that's what the regulations probably aim to achieve. But as I say, I don't know how it's going to filter out post or under national level in provinces and local.
Right, thank you, Prof. I see there's more questions that are coming in. A further question from Conrad. He has asked, what does the Act state regarding elections? And I think because we're heading into elections next year, will the regulations, I'm assuming that should they be in place during the times of elections, does that have any impact on the elections and the processes that happen in that regard? I see Robert has also asked a question. I think it's one of the points that you raised earlier on, but I think maybe for further reassurance, in terms of the possibility of government declaring a state of disaster in the future for other human-created disasters like crime, employment rate, and many more. And I think you did note in just how this can also be open for abuse if we start to set a precedent like we have right now. I see my colleague Andrea has also asked how likely will litigation succeed in the current energy crisis if the state of disaster is challenged in court. And then I see Daniel as well from Suntime has asked a question to say, do you think a forced reduction in electricity usage for companies and individual households is something that can be enforced, similar to under COVID where the movement was restricted? Yeah, so there's a lot of questions that are coming. Maybe if you just want to tackle them one by one. Thank you, Prof. Thank you very much.
Yeah, interesting question, the one around elections. I mean, we can obviously ask why the state of disaster now? Yeah, and that's one of the first questions I asked, because I also come from a political science background. So sorry, I've got this in the back of my mind. What is this, the Act state in terms of elections? Well, the far-reaching powers now given to government, they can use this to, for instance, postpone elections, but they can only do that with very good reasons. In other words, they must show that the intent of or having elections is not in the intent of the state of disaster. For instance, let's say other scenario, like we have earthquake in Syria, people are in peril, there's no way you're going to get them to the election box. That would typically be a good example of it. But this can also be used for political purposes. In other words, let's extend the elections because of various reasons, to put ourselves in a better situation. They can do that, but they would have to have extremely good motivation why this falls under the state of disaster. So I don't think something like that would happen. It could, I mean, put nothing past people with that has power, but that is certainly something that they could do. But I don't think it's likely to happen. I don't see that happening. What's the possibility of government to declare state of disaster for future, for human created? Yeah, Robert, that's a good question. That's a main thing that bothers me, is the fact that if a president is created and the courts agree to that president, then you might find a situation where they can start doing this. But then you're managing by disasters. Then you're almost on the brink of a failed state. And I think that is what we as civil society must aim to prevent, is that there's this unnecessary abuse of extraordinary powers that we should guard against. Because then you constantly, in our case, and the more I think of the process we went through, it's something that we kind of missed when we drew up the Disaster Management Act, and that is parliamentary oversight. There was an assumption that there will always be oversight, but we couldn't see 20 years into the future. Now, under the state of disaster, there's no parliamentary oversight to the declaration of a state of disaster or the renewal of it. And that is a problem. That's a major problem in our democracy. It is a more than a gray area in the legislation. And coming out of COVID, there was a drive to get the Disaster Management Act amended to make provision for parliamentary oversight. But we haven't gone this far. And I mean, there's probably various reasons. But yes, it can be used, but it shouldn't, because it is not a disaster. It wouldn't adhere to the definition of a disaster, the same way that this electricity crisis, in my mind, does not adhere to the specific definition of a state of disaster. And it's a slippery slope once you go down that route. Then you're basically giving over power without a democratic mechanism into it. Andrea asked, how likely will litigation succeed in the current energy crisis? Yes. Every day I become less confident. And it's a good question. I think what the courts will probably ask would center around the outcomes of the state of disaster, the intent of the law, and whether it is justified. The challenge to the state of disaster under COVID in all cases failed, because they could use that as a justification. This is a wee bit different, but we must realize that the courts most probably would stop short of that second element that I highlight, and that is, will it protect lives and livelihoods? And that, I think, is going to be what's going to drive the decision of the courts around this. So to me, it's currently still a 50-50. I don't think it's as much a soccer game that we have to win than to ensure that our democracy is respected and that the intent of laws are kept in place. And in this case, that we ensure that our people doesn't suffer. That to me is the more important question. And whether we can do it through the state of disaster or other legislation, that is what the courts now must decide. And I'm still on the side of just get your house in order. So let's see. And then Daniel asked, do you think a forced reduction in electricity usage of company, individual households or something? Yes, that could happen. I mean, we weren't allowed to buy roast chicken under COVID. So, you know, the argument around using less electricity is much easier to make than don't buy open-heeled shoes or something like that. But it could. The government, if we see we're going to approach this fine line of total grid failure, then a regulation could come out to say, well, now we have to curb electricity. Interesting, I read, I can't remember where, that there was already a kind of a drive towards the major users of electricity to say, let's target them first, and not obviously individual households, which will have many people quite angry, but do that in a kind of systematic manner and look at our mines, look at our agricultural sector, etc. once again, it's the same argument when it came to COVID. How much are we prepared to sacrifice in terms of our economy to address the situation? So that's I think a very fine balance. But it could be one of the things. I hope not. I don't see that happening from where I'm sitting, but like I'm not an energy specialist, so it could well be used. Kulani, did I cover all the questions?
Yeah, in the interest of time, there's still more. I think we've just got 5 more minutes left in our session, but I see Jance's comment as well that has been posted on the chat box, and it also attaches to one question I had to say, then with all that has been said, how does then organized agriculture posture itself? And I see Jance's question here where his comment where he says laws may be set aside by a court of law for vagueness. Is it not best if someone immediately approaches a court to have the state of disaster declaration set aside? And I'm assuming that stems from the fact that some of the legislations are quite vague, as you've also pointed out in that regard. Do you maybe want to take that before we move on to the other 2 questions I see, Prof?
Yeah, sure. No, yes, Solidarity and OTA has already put in challenges against the state of disaster. So that's already happening. So we'll see how that pans out. They were a bit quick in the sense that we waited quite long for regulations. So if I remember correctly, Solidarity was the first to file, and then OTA just shortly after that, without seeing new regulations, which in this case, if we read the regulations, actually counts in their favor because the regulations are absolutely horrible. So it's already being challenged. So let's sit out and see what happens. But they're obviously going to use the challenges under the state of disaster under COVID to measure up against what we see now.
Thank you, Prof. Question from Conrad again. Why is the disaster management under a specific minister and department? Is this legislated?
Yes, that's my other gripe, and that is the placement of the disaster management centers. And in the past 20 years, I've written quite a lot about that. We are one of the few countries that find the disaster management center under a ministry. In most other countries, especially in Africa, they fall under the office of the president or the deputy president or the prime minister. In our Disaster Management Act, kind of leaves the door open. It says that disaster management falls under a minister responsible for disaster management. So the president determines which minister that is. So quite a number of years ago, when the presidency started to build up their power base, and we saw more ministers linked to the presidency, and when the new minister in the presidency was actually brought in, we tried to drive that he becomes responsible for disaster management. So the national center moves into the presidency, and that wasn't very successful. Currently, there's still a lot of drive to get the disaster management center out of the line department, for the simple reason it follows suit at provincial and local level. Now you find that it doesn't have the stature that it should have at a provincial level, and it can't hold the other departments accountable, because now I find myself under the department. I can't hold the head of a department accountable to do their disaster risk reduction, and that's just a management, a cumbersome management structure, and that's why it is under cooperative governance. Coming into in 2000 with the Y2K problem, they activated the National Disaster Management Center for the first time, and the focus was still, because of civil protection, was on local government, and that's why they put it under local government, and then later became local government cooperative affairs. So it was a continuation of historical trend instead of breaking it and putting it where I think it should be. And I still think it should be in the presidency. It'll cut a lot of questions, and it'll make the president at the end of the day responsible for this. So that's just my take on it.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a minute left in our session. If there's any final round of questions, we can take them. But in the meantime, just one final question that I'm seeing on the chat box, maybe before we get others or any other question that may come online. Sigjek Arma has also asked again regarding the curtailing of environmental regulations. Is there a threat of gas mining, especially fracking, being pushed ahead? And I guess it couples with expropriation without compensation. take the land to get to the gas, coal, oil, etc., to meet the free basic energy needs. Yeah, I try to decrypt that as best as possible.
Thank you, Jack. There's two things here. The first, and the regulations actually already makes provision for that. So if government thinks this is a way of mitigating the situation, they can push it through by this particular regulation. But the environmental issues, I think, is too sensitive. That it's going to be a long time before I think they can mingle on those type of regulations. The easier type of environmental regulations would be something in the line of, okay, car power ships. Let's bypass environmental regulations on that, and we get the car power ships in. That'll be an easier sell than, I think, your question. I think your question is politically too sensitive. Although you could probably do it, I think that goes way beyond what the state of disaster intends. Once again, they have to show that if these regulations, if it's necessary to have fracking and expropriation without compensation, etc., and there's no other method to use to better the situation, then it would probably be kind of justified, but it's not. So I don't think that is something that, hopefully, touch wood, we don't need to worry about. I think that something like that goes way beyond what the state of disaster intends, and I can't see any court in South Africa not throwing that out.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. I see there are no other further questions. Thank you so much for your time. It has really been an insightful session, and we thank you for the engagement and just your insights in this regard. I think I have done my part. Andrea, I'm not too sure if you are doing the closing, or is Krista online maybe to do a vote of thanks on behalf of Agri SA. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, Kulani. I think Krista left for another meeting, but nonetheless, Professor, thank you so much for today's session. I think we all found it very insightful, and I'm very thankful about the engagement from our colleagues. Yeah, from our side, we would like to just establish a relationship with you going forward. I think you are a very good or astute professional in this regard. Yeah, so from our side, thank you very much for your time on this.
It is my pleasure. Thanks for the invite. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Have a great day all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye.